and it's my pleasure to present to you a short excerpt of my work on the history of the defense intelligence structures of the USA. And specifically, we're going to talk about the history of the Defense Intelligence Agency, or DIA, and shed light on the processes that culminated in the creation of it. Key elements there will be issues of centralization in defense intelligence, or DI, political military intelligence relations, as well as the unique source situation for research in the field. So yeah, all of these will hopefully be insightful aspects and lead to a fruitful discussion in the panel shortly after. So all of you should have a general idea what DIA is today. For the purpose of this presentation, it suffices to say that it is the principal source of foreign intelligence to combat-related missions. And this is achieved by not only producing own intelligence products, but also coordinating intelligence activities which do remain at the military services, for instance, US Air Force intelligence. So not only are there dedicated analysis activities, DIA also regularly conducts own clandestine missions, and they may carry out by their mission virtually all intelligence activities, from technical forms such as SIGINT to human intelligence. There are most notably also several subordinated services, such as the Defense Attaché System for military diplomatic relations worldwide, as well as the Directorate of Science and Technology, through which DIA becomes the national manager for measurement and signature intelligence. Yes, but let's not focus on these elements today. Rather, let's talk about the DIA's main mission, which is publicly stated in this regularly updated DoD directive, which you can see here. And this present status quo, with DIA being a centralized actor and the authoritative voice of DI issues in the US, was the start of my research project during my graduate studies at UniBW. And in detail, I wanted to uncover how centralization of DI actually took place, and how the military services, who were prior to that wholly responsible for military intelligence matters and activities themselves, how they reacted to this change. So for that, we actually need to go back in time and in history to the beginning of World War II. And as most evident by the fateful events of Pearl Harbor, the DI comprised an important role in the war. And while the roots of US military intelligence went as far back as to the Revolutionary War, the capabilities existed only on a military level and really didn't happen on a national level. So in practice, the War Department and the Department of the Navy produced their own intelligence with their own experts for their own missions. So the bulk of it and the bulk of the activities naturally happened on a tactical and operational level, because it was, again, most relevant for the military. An example of this during the war was the Military Intelligence Division of the United States Army in the Pacific. They conducted what we would call today human, SIGINT, and even GEOINT in the form of mapmaking. And on this slide here, you can see Japanese-American translators of the Military Intelligence Division. So while the performance of the whole system was certainly to be commended, the history is incredibly diffuse, and it is really hard to compare the performance across various campaigns. More often than not, it was left to the conviction of theater commanders personally to conduct certain intelligence activities. And this again made efficient pooling and sharing of intelligence products and resources even impossible. A really good example of this is the personality cult, you can say, around General Douglas MacArthur, who did not really allow any other intelligence agencies into the China-Burma theater, which is also why the OSS was really not active there and rather focused on the European theater of war. So needless to say, the structure was not without its weaknesses and backed radical reform after the war. And those proposed changes, however, did not come in the form of dedicated reforms, but were rather embedded in the general post-World War II government and defense reforms. President Truman, on the top right here at the time, started a myriad of these processes in the course of the Hoover Commissions, which were ultimately designed for to account for the US's new status as a superpower in the world. So in defense and intelligence specifically, Truman imagined both leaner and more effective structures, as well as politically accountable actors. And the first step towards this was the National Security Act of 1947, which first supported separate military services under the then newly established DoD. It was, however, really long until the spirit of the law could be enacted. And only the Defense Reorganization Act of 1958, by the following President Eisenhower, fully realized decentralization of the military. This was because the military leadership resisted all kinds of centralization reforms and all proposals towards that. They were really embedded in turf wars about budget, about influence, and we're having none of that. However, Truman and Eisenhower both shared very similar visions of a leaner structure and a more efficient DI apparatus. And even the idea of a separate agency for defense intelligence was verifiably imagined way back in the day. For Truman, this was the case even when he was a senator. So after myriad of processes, only towards the end of the Eisenhower presidency, the intentions to create such an entity went explicitly forward and were set to be finalized in the Kennedy presidency. Yes, and Kennedy was indeed very interested in taking the issue further, and research has shown that there are multiple reasons for that. On the one hand, the main reason was that the administration direly needed a central DI authority in the context of the heating Cold War. It became increasingly clear that it could not be left to the individual services because they just didn't have the big picture in mind. And furthermore, this was a really interesting point, there were direct policy reasons even. So President Kennedy and his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, who you can see here, they favored the emerging nuclear strategic concept of flexible response towards Soviet aggression, in contrast to the doctrine of massive retaliation, which was the go-to doctrine before that. So to enact this and make this strategy feasible, they needed a sophisticated and effective defense intelligence apparatus. So with all the need and with all of this clear, the Joint Study Group finished a report, and this was basically the starting point and the basis on which DIA was created a few months later in 1961. So going to the early operational history, unfortunately, it was far less successful than was initially hoped. Turf wars from the military leadership, they did not go away quickly, and DIA first had to fight severely for the resources they needed to fulfill their mission. They also failed their so-called trial by fire in the Cuban Missile Crisis and couldn't really perform satisfactorily, for instance, in the Vietnam War or regarding the China PRC atomic bomb tests. This is also what shaped DIA's image within the wider US intelligence community first. There were several clashes and controversies, which can be easily retraced using primary sources such as declassified documents and memoranda. Several that I used during my research process are pictured here. Points of concern were, for instance, bureaucratic struggles, the lacking performance of DIA, and differences in assessment, most notably for troop numbers in Vietnam. However, it needs to be mentioned that agencies such as CIA cut DIA some slack when it came to lacking operational performance during their formative years at least, and quoting that the, and I quote, usual growing pains, unquote, are to be expected when creating such an entity. And yes, as they say, the rest is history. DIA did evolve and establish itself to be a credible producer of defense intelligence in the 70s and valorously performed during the Cold War and the global war on terror since. So I want to offer some short lessons learned. Specifically, in this case of the creation history of DIA and the genesis of DIA, the myriad of reforms in governance and military had to be completed first before the reforms of DI actually could commence. And I think this was really exacerbated by the fierce opposition of the military stakeholders against any idea of centralizing DI activities or any activities of from this perspective, because they acted from the turf war perspective, and centralization for them meant taking it away, be it budget, be it capabilities, and so on. So this alone is a key testament to the intricate nature of political military intelligence relations. Adding on to that, it can be well observed that the idea of a joint DI agency was ultimately only realized due to the continued enormous political pressure towards this reform. I'm trying to not drift off too much into territory of counterfactual history, but I reckon that if the effort hadn't persisted over 3 presidencies with Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy, it was also a bipartisan effort. Efforts may have been ended differently, or the agency would not have been founded in this way. So lastly, it seems that the main motivations of the political dimension and their demands towards intelligence are central accountability, a more economic budget, and more effective performance. And I think this speaks for itself. It is already intuitive to see that the amalgamation of expertise and experts leads to higher quality intelligence products, and the removal of parallel structures just makes the whole apparatus more efficient and more economic. So a point which lastly really intrigued me, and it might be an interesting topic for, I think, tomorrow's panel. The Kennedy administration really put so much resolve towards decentralization because they wanted to enable their new strategic concept. And I didn't manage to confirm it thus far in the research process, but it could be a case that decentralization might support greater strategic scope of action on an international level. And if this is supported, actually, it could be a key argument for centralizing DI activities, also in other countries who do not yet have a centralized DI system.